to any city in Africa or in Latin America and eventually see people living in shacks, in the slums, shacks that they possess, where they live, where they make their day-to-day livings, but shacks that eventually are not recognized by the legal system in terms of transferability. So it's the so-called dead capital because it's not transferable in the formal legal system. The example of Quinty shows a dead capital. Quinty has a business that eventually could be transferred, that eventually could be given as a guarantee, but the legal system doesn't recognize his business, doesn't recognize the possibility that Quinty could give that business as a guarantee. As a consequence, it's a dead capital. It has a value, but the system doesn't recognize that. The example I wanted to point out, as you can see in that image, is two different worlds living in the same geographic area. The so-called dead capital, the informal economy, and the system that recognizes the assets and the identity and the rights and capabilities of other people. So we can say to a large extent that in many parts of Latin America and Africa, people are poor because of the law. And those that eventually succeed, they succeed in spite of the law. So the law, to a large extent, is part of the problem in terms of poverty in many parts of the world. Why is it part of the problem? Because we face people whose rights are not recognized. The example of Quinty is of a person whose right to eventually give a business as a guarantee is not recognized. So in many parts of Latin America and Africa, people might have rights, or they believe they have rights, but those are not recognized by the legal system. We face that under the form of people in the informal economy, but also it can be present when rights are not recognized to indigenous people. In many parts of Africa, for example, there are some tribes where the connection with the formal legal system means that the rights of those people are not really recognized. We also face in some parts of Latin America and Africa discrimination against minorities, or discrimination for gender, or discrimination for being an immigrant. And what that means is that those people eventually are prohibited or are denied the rights that they could have in order to prosper in the legal system. So on one hand, we have in Latin America and Africa rights not being recognized by the legal systems. And as I pointed out at the beginning, denying rights basically means denying capabilities. And if you don't have capabilities, then of course you don't have the possibility of taking advantage of opportunities. But even in some instances where the rights are recognized, the rights cannot be enforceable. So people might have rights, they can be provided in the statutes, but those rights cannot be enforced for different reasons. Why? One, the institutions might be weak. For example, courts might not be reliable, they could be inefficient or not independent. As a result, in the example of Quinty could have a right, maybe the legal system could recognize him the possibility to give his business as a guarantee under its so-called secure transaction law. But the courts could not be reliable. As a consequence, the bank would not be willing to give Quinty that loan because they could face the lack of independence and efficiency of the courts. So weak institutions, to a large extent, also affect the possibility of people having rights. Another possibility of people having rights but not having the possibility of enforcing those rights is when they are located in remote areas. For example, in Latin America and Africa as well, there are people who live in the jungle, and the institutions, for example, don't reach them in the locations where they need to enforce specific rights. So the fact that the institutions are located only in the cities in urban areas eventually can affect the possibility of people enforcing rights. Another possibility of having rights and not being able to enforce the rights is when the only possibility to enforce the rights is to do it in the official language. And in many parts of Latin America and Africa, people don't have command, don't know, don't write, cannot speak the official language. An example that comes to my mind is in Gambia, in Africa, where the official language is English, and in order to register a business, it needs to be conducted in English. However, in remote parts of Gambia, in the Gambia River, deep into the heart of Africa, people speak Wolof or Mandinga. And eventually, if the only way they have to register the business is in English and not in Wolof or Mandinga, they would be basically stopped from the possibility of enforcing their rights. So as you can see, people can have rights, people can eventually be hindered from the possibility of enforcing those rights. But we also face in Latin America and Africa situations where people have rights, the rights are recognized, where they are also able to enforce those rights, but there are no opportunities. For example, when the state doesn't leave any space available for people to do business or to take advantage of their rights, or when the vested interests have a monopoly of the specific spaces for people to take advantage of those rights. So as you can see, in many parts of Latin America and Africa, people are poor because they run out of choices, as I mentioned at the end, at the beginning. And when that happens, you can say that those people are not free. If there is no choice, there is no freedom. And we can say that if the law is part of the problem, the law can also be part of the solution. How can we do that? We can do that, of course, through legal reforms. One possibility is to do it through local legal reforms. But that is not out of obstacles. Of course, when we come to the issue of undertaking local legal reforms, the best methodology is to do it through the so-called consensus building, to have the involvement of the stakeholders so that everyone can have the feeling of ownership of the statutes that are being implemented. But in many parts of Latin America and Africa, people lack the so-called legal identity. For the formal legal system, they do not exist. I personally have an experience in El Salvador where I was involved in the process of drafting a law on business restructuring. And we approached the Association of Small Medium Enterprises in the formal sector. And we asked them for their opinion so they could be part of the process of drafting a specific law. And the answer we got from them was that they thought their opinion was not going to be considered because the formal legal system with which they were interacting did not recognize them. And the formal legal system, the people on this side of the equation basically told us not to consider the opinion of the informal sector because those people didn't count. In many parts of Africa, you have realities where people do not have what we know here in the States as ID, or in other parts of the world, ID cards. So as a consequence of not having legal identification, therefore they don't count for the process of consensus building. But of course, in spite of that possibility, local legal reforms can provide a possibility in order to promote opportunities, inclusion, and equity. But as everyone involved in the process of legal reform knows, law is not everything when it comes to promoting development. There are other ways also to do it. And in addition to law, you need to do other things in order to promote the inclusion. One possibility, of course, is the